I can't take this anymore.
Before you read a single word of this story, I want you to do something for me. I want you to think about the person in your life who knows everything about you. The person who was there when you cried at 3 in the morning. The person who sat beside you at your mother's hospital bed. The person you called first, before anyone else, when something good happened and when something terrible happened. Now I want you to imagine that this person, the one who knows every corner of your heart, looked you in the eye every single day for years, smiled at you, hugged you, told you she loved you, while quietly, methodically, and deliberately destroying the life you had built. Imagine discovering that the warmth she showed you was a performance, that every holiday dinner, every phone call, every Sunday afternoon at your kitchen table was a carefully maintained act of deception. Imagine finding out that the person you trusted the most was the person you should have been protecting yourself from all along. That is not a hypothetical. That is the story you are about to hear. And I promise you, by the time we reach the end, you will never look at the people closest to you quite the same way again. Before we go any further, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. We truly love hearing from our community all around the world, and do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let us get into this story. Her name was Carolyn Renee Mitchell. She was born on a Tuesday in the fall of 1978 in a small town called Harlan, dear Kentucky. One of those places where the mountains press in so close on all sides that the sky above you always feels a little smaller than it should, and where everybody knows your name before you are old enough to know theirs. She was the first child of James and Dorothy Mitchell, a quiet, God-fearing couple who worked hard, paid their bills on time, and believed without reservation that family was the most sacred thing a person could possess. James worked at the county road department for 31 years. Dorothy taught 3rd grade at Harlan Elementary for 22. They were not wealthy people. They were not glamorous people. But they were steady. They were present. And they loved their children with the full and uncomplicated devotion of parents who had never once questioned whether love was enough to hold a family together. 2 years after Caroline came into the world, her sister was born. Her name was Rebecca Ann Mitchell. And from the very first day, Rebecca was different. Not in a way that anyone could put their finger on immediately, not in a way that anyone would have labeled as dangerous or troubling at the time, but different in the way that some children are different from the moment they arrive. Where Caroline was quiet and watchful, Rebecca was loud and magnetic. Where Caroline sat in the corner of the room reading a book, Rebecca was already in the center of it, working the space, making people laugh, making people lean in. Dorothy Mitchell used to say that Rebecca had been born knowing exactly how to make a room love her. She said it like it was a gift. She did not know, for a very long time, that it was also a weapon. Growing up in Harlan, the two girls were close in the way that sisters in small towns tend to be close, not necessarily because they were the same, but because they were each other's only option. There were no neighborhood kids on their street. There was no sprawling social world to retreat into. There was school, there was church on Sundays, there was the Mitchell house, and there was each other. Caroline helped Rebecca with her math homework at the kitchen table. Rebecca braided Caroline's hair before school picture day. They shared a bedroom with a window that looked out onto their father's garden, and on summer nights, when the heat in Harlan sat heavy and slow, they would lie in their beds in the dark and talk for hours about what their lives were going to look like one day. Caroline wanted to be a nurse. Rebecca wanted to be famous. She was never very specific about what for, only that she wanted people to know her name. Caroline used to smile at that and think it was just Rebecca being dramatic. She had no idea how seriously her sister meant it. They were not a perfect family. No family is. James Mitchell had a temper that ran quiet for long stretches and then surface suddenly and unexpectedly, like a fault line shifting under pressure. He was never violent. He was never cruel. But his disappointment was a heavy thing to carry, and both girls learned early how to read the atmosphere of a room when their father walked into it. Dorothy Mitchell, for her part, was a peacekeeper above all else, a woman who had decided somewhere in her 20s that the highest possible calling in a family was the prevention of conflict, even when conflict was the only honest response to the truth. These were the dynamics the Mitchell girls absorbed without ever being taught them directly. Caroline learned to hold things in, to process quietly, to wait. Rebecca learned that charm was armor, and that if you could make someone smile at you, they were far less likely to hold you accountable for what you had done. By the time both girls reached high school, the gap between them had grown wider, though neither of them would have named it as a gap. Caroline was a solid, steady student, not the top of her class, but close enough to earn a scholarship to the University of Kentucky in Lexington, which was, in the context of Harlan in the mid-1990s, an extraordinary achievement. She was the kind of girl that teachers quietly rooted for, the kind of girl who stayed after class to ask questions and showed up to things early and took her responsibilities with the full weight of someone who understood that opportunity was not something you wasted. Rebecca, meanwhile, was the most popular girl in the junior class at Harlan High School. She was on the homecoming court 2 years running. She dated the captain of the football team, and then the captain of the basketball team, and somehow remained close friends with both of them afterward. Teachers liked her too, but differently from the way they liked Caroline. They liked Rebecca the way you like a bright light in a room, warmly, but also with a slight squint, aware that looking directly at it for too long was not entirely comfortable. Caroline left for Lexington in the fall of 1996. She was 18 years old. She had $200 in a checking account, and she had never been more than 40 miles from home on her own. She was terrified and she was thrilled, and for the first time in her life, she had the dizzying sensation of being entirely herself, not someone's older daughter, not someone's more serious sister, but just Caroline, alone in a city that did not yet know her name. She called home every Sunday. She sent her mother handwritten cards at holidays. She visited for Thanksgiving and Christmas, and always stayed a few days longer than she planned, because being back in that small house on the mountain roads of Harlan still felt, in ways she could not fully articulate, like being wrapped in something warm and real. Rebecca called her too from time to time. The calls were mostly about Rebecca, her new boyfriend, her plans, a fight she had with their mother, a party she had been to. Caroline listened. She always listened. That was the role she had always played. It was in her second year at the University of Kentucky that Caroline met a young man named Daniel Scott Hargrove. He was a junior, studying civil engineering, from a small town in eastern Tennessee called Kingsport, and he had the particular quality that certain men have of making the people around them feel not just liked, but genuinely seen. He was not the most conventionally handsome man in any room. He was average height, medium build, with dark eyes and a slow smile that took a moment to arrive and then stayed. But he was attentive in a way that was unusual, particularly for a 20-year-old college junior. He remembered things. He asked follow-up questions. He showed up when he said he would show up. Caroline had spent enough of her life watching people not show up that this quality in a man she had just met felt almost startling. They began as study partners in a general biology requirement they were both taking to fulfill a credit. They became friends first, walking to the campus library together, eating lunch in the student union, spending long evenings talking about where they came from and where they wanted to go. Daniel wanted to build things, not metaphorically, literally. He wanted to design bridges and roads and infrastructure, the invisible architecture underneath the visible world that most people never thought about, but that held everything together. Caroline found this beautiful in a way she did not immediately know how to express. She was drawn to the idea of a man who thought about foundations, about what holds things up. She was, without fully realizing it, describing herself as well. They became a couple in the spring of 1998. By summer, they had said the word love for the first time, standing in a field outside of Lexington, with fireflies rising up around them in the early dark. And Caroline felt something settle inside her that she had not known was unsettled. They graduated in the spring of 2000. Daniel accepted a job with a civil engineering firm in Nashville, Tennessee. Caroline had been accepted to a nursing program there and followed him, not as a sacrifice, but as a genuine choice. Nashville was not Harlan, and the distance from home, she told herself, was healthy. It was growing. She believed that completely. She believed a great many things in those years that she would later understand had been beliefs assembled from incomplete information. Nashville in the early 2000s was a city in the middle of becoming something. The downtown was changing. The neighborhoods were shifting. It had the particular energy of a place that knows it is on the edge of something bigger, and Caroline and Daniel arrived in it, young and newly graduated, and full of the particular optimism of people who have not yet been tested by the weight of real life. They rented an apartment in East Nashville, a 2-bedroom with hardwood floors and a clawfoot bathtub that took 20 minutes to fill, and that Caroline loved unreasonably. She was working 12-hour shifts at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. Daniel was spending long days at the engineering firm, learning from men twice his age who had built half the interstates in Tennessee. They were tired all the time, and they were happy all the time, and they ate dinner late at a small table by the kitchen window and talked about the day and fell asleep on the couch, watching television. And it was not a glamorous life, but it was a genuine one. It was theirs. Rebecca had not gone to college. After high school, she had spent a year in Harlan, working at the pharmacy on Main Street, then moved to Knoxville with a boyfriend whose name was Chad, who sold insurance and played in a country band on weekends, and who was not, Caroline observed quietly on the phone calls, very good for her sister. Rebecca called Caroline from Knoxville semi-regularly during those years. The calls had the same quality they always had. Rebecca's voice filling the line. Rebecca's life occupying all available space. Rebecca occasionally pausing long enough to ask how Caroline was doing before pivoting back to herself. Caroline answered the question briefly each time, and then listened, because listening to Rebecca was something she had always done without questioning whether it was a balanced exchange. It was just the way things were between them. In the fall of 2003, Rebecca moved to Nashville. She had broken up with Chad, or he had broken up with her, depending on which version of the story she was telling on which particular day, and she wanted a new start. And where else would she go but to her sister? She asked Caroline if she could stay with them for a few weeks while she got herself settled, and Caroline said yes immediately, without hesitation, because that is what you do when your sister needs you. That is what family means. At least, that is what Caroline believed family meant. Rebecca arrived in October with 3 suitcases and a cardboard box of kitchen things and a smile that filled the apartment like sunlight. Daniel, meeting her in person for the first time, said she was exactly what he had expected, based on everything Caroline had told him. Rebecca laughed at that and touched his arm and said she hoped that was a good thing. Daniel said of course it was. Rebecca stayed for 6 weeks. She found a job at a marketing company downtown, found an apartment in the Midtown neighborhood, and moved out on a Saturday afternoon in November with Caroline's help and Daniel's truck. Caroline stood in the parking lot of Rebecca's new building afterward and felt a complicated mixture of things that she did not spend very much time examining. There was relief. The apartment had felt crowded in ways that were difficult to name, a fullness of atmosphere that had not been entirely comfortable, and there was also guilt about the relief, because she loved her sister. And feeling relieved that her sister was leaving, felt disloyal. She pushed the feeling down. She had always been good at that. The years that followed were, by any outward measure, the best years of Caroline's life. She and Daniel got engaged in the spring of 2005, on a Saturday morning in their kitchen over coffee, which was not a grand gesture and was exactly what Caroline would have wanted if she had been asked. He had the ring, a modest solitaire that he had picked out himself because he knew her well enough to know she would not have wanted to be consulted in advance. He slid it across the breakfast table and said he wanted to spend the rest of his life with her, and he hoped she felt the same way. She said yes without a pause, and then they sat there for a long moment in the quiet kitchen with the ring on her finger and the morning light coming through the window, and neither of them felt the need to say anything else. It was enough. They were enough. They were married the following June, in a small ceremony at a venue outside of Nashville, with a garden that stayed green even in the Tennessee summer, and 63 people who loved them both seated on white wooden chairs in the late afternoon light. Dorothy and James Mitchell drove up from Harlan the day before. Rebecca was the maid of honor. She wore a dusty rose dress that Caroline had chosen because she knew it would look beautiful on Rebecca. And Rebecca did look beautiful. And she gave a toast at the reception that made the entire room cry. A toast about what it meant to watch your sister build a life worth believing in, about how proud she was, about how much she loved Caroline, about how much she loved them both. People who were at that wedding still talk about that toast. They still say it was one of the best they have ever heard. Caroline has thought about that toast many times since. She has thought about what it costs a person to look into the eyes of a room full of people and perform love that is not real. She has thought about the particular kind of coldness required to do what Rebecca did at that altar, to stand at her sister's side, in the dress her sister chose, and smile the way she smiled. But on that afternoon, in June 2006, none of that was visible. Just what was visible was simple and beautiful. Two people who loved each other getting married in a garden, surrounded by family, with the maid of honor's voice still echoing through the tent, and the string quartet starting up again, and the summer evening settling in around them. Caroline danced with her father. Daniel danced with his mother. Rebecca danced with 3 different men, and made all of them feel like they were the only person in the room. And afterward, when the venue was clearing out and the caterers were folding tables, and the night had turned warm and quiet, Caroline sat in a chair by the garden wall and looked out at the lights of Nashville in the distance, and felt, with a completeness she had rarely felt before, that her life was exactly where it was supposed to be. Marriage, as anyone who has been in one long enough will tell you, is not a single thing. It is not the moment on the altar, and it is not the first year of navigating each other's habits, and it is not the early middle years when the rhythms settle and the life expands. It is all of those things, in sequence, building on each other, and the quality of it at any given moment is entirely dependent on what you have been building underneath. For the first several years, Caroline and Daniel were building something solid. He was advancing at the firm, moving from project management into senior engineering. She had been promoted twice at Vanderbilt, had taken on a supervisory role in her unit, and was by any reasonable measure a woman in her early 30s who had found her footing. They bought a house in 2008, a 4-bedroom Craftsman in the Sylvan Park neighborhood, the kind of house that had good bones and needed work, and that they spent weekends restoring with the focused pleasure of 2 people who liked having a project together. Rebecca came to dinner on Sundays. This had been the pattern since Rebecca moved to Nashville, an informal but consistent arrangement. Sunday evenings, usually a meal that Caroline cooked, sometimes a bottle of wine, sometimes a football game on the television, sometimes just the three of them talking at the kitchen table until well past 10. It was a good tradition. It was one of the things Carolyn was most proud of, that despite the distance from Harlan, despite the separate orbits of adult life, she had managed to keep her sister close. She had managed to make them a family in Nashville, even without their parents nearby. Rebecca always seemed to love these Sundays. She was warm and funny and engaged, full of stories from the marketing firm, full of opinions about the city and the food and the music. She made Daniel laugh. She made the evenings feel fuller and more alive. Caroline was grateful for all of this. She was grateful to her sister for being exactly the kind of sister she had always hoped she would be. What Caroline did not know, could not have known, because the knowledge was being carefully kept from her by both of the people she trusted most, was that the ease between her husband and her sister was not the ease of two people who had grown comfortable through years of family meals. It was something else entirely, something that had its roots. It would later emerge, not in the present, but in the past. Something that had been there, quietly and deliberately, from the very beginning. Rebecca had been in that apartment for 6 weeks in the fall of 2003. 6 weeks in the same space as Daniel. 6 weeks watching him leave for work in the morning and come home in the evening and cook dinner and watch television and be exactly the kind of man that Carolyn had always described in those phone calls from Lexington. And what Rebecca had seen in those 6 weeks, she had decided she wanted. Not abstractly, not wistfully, as a plan. The exact nature of what transpired between Rebecca and Daniel during those first years, when it crossed from something contained into something active, would not become fully clear to Caroline until much later. What she knew at the time was only the ordinary surface of things. She knew that Rebecca and Daniel got along well. She knew that Rebecca texted Daniel occasionally when she needed help with something, moving furniture, fixing a leaky faucet, questions about the logistics of her apartment. She knew that Daniel was always willing to help because Daniel was that kind of man, or at least he presented as that kind of man, and she had never had cause to think otherwise. She filed each small thing away as evidence of a family that functioned well, evidence of a marriage in which she had chosen wisely, evidence that her life was good and real and safe. She was not paranoid. She was not the kind of woman who checked her husband's phone or drove past his office or asked questions she did not already know the answer to. She was a woman who had built her entire adult life on the foundation of trust. Trust in the man she had married. Trust in the sister she had raised alongside. And she did not approach either relationship from the defensive crouch of suspicion because she had no reason to. This is important to understand and to sit with, because what comes next is not the story of a woman who ignored obvious signs and therefore earned what followed. It is the story of a woman who lived in good faith in a world that was being operated in bad faith, and who eventually discovered what had been happening and decided, with more composure and more intelligence than either of the people who had wronged her could have anticipated, exactly what she was going to do about it. It was a Tuesday evening in the late winter of 2015. Carolyn remembers the day specifically and clearly. She has said in various retellings of this story that certain days acquire a particular texture in memory, that they are not blurry or impressionistic the way most days eventually become, but sharp and specific and fully dimensional, as though the mind, understanding what is at stake, decides to hold every detail. She remembers that she had worked a long shift. She remembers that the drive home had taken 40 minutes longer than usual because of an accident on the interstate. She remembers that when she walked in the front door, the house smelled like the pasta sauce she had left in the slow cooker that morning, and that for a moment she stood in the entryway with her coat still on, just breathing it in, grateful for the ordinary comfort of it. She remembers all of this, and she remembers what happened next. Daniel was in the shower. His phone was on the kitchen counter, face up, next to the stack of mail she had been meaning to sort for 3 days. It buzzed once. She was standing 6 feet away, pouring herself a glass of water. She was not trying to see the screen. She was not hovering or lurking or doing anything other than being a tired woman at the end of a long day in her own kitchen. And from 6 feet away, the name on the screen was Rebecca. That was not strange. Rebecca texted Daniel periodically. It had always seemed normal, because Caroline had spent years normalizing it, years deciding that ease between her husband and her sister was a feature of her life, rather than a fault line in it. She walked over to the counter. She will tell you that she is not sure, even now, what exactly made her pick up the phone instead of simply moving it aside. Some people call it instinct. Some call it the accumulated weight of small things finally becoming heavy enough to register. Whatever it was, she picked it up. She read 3 lines. Just 3 lines. She put the phone back down exactly where it was. She walked to the cabinet, put the glass of water on the shelf, turned off the kitchen light, walked upstairs, and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. She did not cry. She sat completely still for a long time, long enough that she heard the shower shut off, heard Daniel moving around in the bathroom, heard him come out and walk to the closet and get dressed and go back downstairs. And she sat in the dark the entire time and did not move. What she was doing, see in those moments, was not falling apart. She had decided, in the span of about 90 seconds between the kitchen counter and the edge of the bed, that she was not going to fall apart. What she was doing was thinking, carefully, precisely, with the focused clarity that comes, sometimes, when shock is cold enough to feel like calm. What those 3 lines told her was not, in themselves, conclusive. They were suggestive. They implied a familiarity that existed outside the territory of family. They contained a reference to something shared that Caroline had not been part of, in a tone that no message between a man and his sister-in-law should have. They were enough. They were enough to tell her that the question she had to answer was not whether something was wrong, but how deep the wrongness went, how long it had been going on, and how thoroughly she needed to document it before she said a single word to anyone. She is very clear about this part of the story. She did not confront that night. She did not confront the next day. She did not call her mother. She did not call her closest friend at work. She went back downstairs 30 minutes after she sat down on that bed, and she ate the pasta she had left in the slow cooker, and she talked to her husband about his day, and she was perfectly calm because she had already decided that calm was the most powerful thing available to her. Over the following 3 weeks, Caroline began doing something that she had never done in nearly 9 years of marriage. She began paying attention in a different register, not the easy, comfortable attention of a woman who trusts the people around her, but the precise and systematic attention of someone documenting a pattern. She started keeping notes on her work laptop, in a password-protected folder, in a file she labeled with the name of a continuing education course she had always meant to take. She wrote down dates and times. She noted when Daniel said he was working late and cross-referenced those nights against text timestamps she had memorized from glances at his phone. She began paying attention to how often Rebecca texted him versus how often Rebecca texted her, and the disproportion, once she was actively measuring it, was something she could not stop seeing. She paid attention to the Sunday dinners differently too, watching the angles between them. The specific choreography of 2 people maintaining a performance for a third person who is not supposed to know it is a performance. What she found over those 3 weeks was not a single dramatic piece of evidence. It was an accumulation, a weight of small things, each individually deniable, collectively undeniable. She found a credit card statement for a card she had not known existed, with charges at a downtown Nashville hotel on 2 separate occasions when Daniel had told her he was out of town for work. She found a restaurant she had never been to charged twice on a regular card, each time on an evening when he had been home late. She knew when she quietly checked the shared cloud storage for their phones, a service they had set up together years earlier, and that Daniel had apparently forgotten gave her automatic access to his call logs, that the calls between her husband and her sister were not occasional, they were regular, they were frequent, and on several occasions they lasted for hours. She did not react to any of this visibly, not once. She continued the Sunday dinners. She continued driving to Vanderbilt for her shifts. She continued folding laundry and paying bills and asking Daniel about his projects at work with the same interested tone she had always used. People who knew Caroline and Daniel during those 3 weeks have said, in retrospect, that nothing seemed different. So that is the measure of what she was carrying, and the measure of who she is. A woman capable, when the situation demands it, of a composure so total that it looks, from the outside, identical to ordinary peace. At the end of those 3 weeks, she called an attorney. Her name was Patricia Walters, and she ran a family law practice in the Berry Hill neighborhood of Nashville, and she had been recommended to Caroline by a colleague at Vanderbilt who had used her services 3 years earlier during a divorce that had been, by all accounts, extremely well managed. Caroline made the appointment from her car in the Vanderbilt parking garage on a Thursday afternoon, 3 minutes after her shift ended. She told no one. She drove to the meeting the following Monday, told Patricia everything she had documented, went and asked what options were available to her. Patricia told her to keep doing exactly what she was doing. She also told her something that changed the course of everything that followed. She told Caroline that in the state of Tennessee, it is legal to record conversations in your own home, provided that at least one party to the conversation consents to the recording. Caroline was always a party to her own home. That, Patricia said, was something worth thinking about. Caroline thought about it for exactly 1 day. On a Wednesday afternoon in March 2015, she purchased a small voice-activated audio recorder at an electronics store in Green Hills. She paid cash. She placed it in the living room of the house in Sylvan Park, in a spot that required no explanation for its presence, and she activated it before she left for her shift the following morning. She did not know what she would find. She had told herself she might find nothing, that she might be wrong, that the 3 lines on a phone screen and the call logs and the hotel charges might have explanations she had not yet discovered, and if they did, she was prepared to hear them. But she was not wrong. And what she found on that recorder over the weeks that followed was not what she had expected to find. It was much worse. The first recording that stopped her cold was from a Thursday afternoon, 9 days after she placed the device. She was listening in her car, parked in front of the Sylvan Park house at 7 in the morning before going in, earbuds in, coffee going cold in the cup holder. The sound quality was clear enough. She heard Daniel's voice first, then Rebecca's. They had been in her home, the home she and Daniel had bought together and spent 2 years restoring, the home where she cooked Sunday dinners and hung family photographs and kept the kind of careful, loving domestic order that a woman builds when she believes her life is real. While she was at work, in the living room, having a conversation that covered in 38 minutes more territory than Caroline had been able to imagine in the worst version of anything she had suspected. They were not talking about logistics. They were not talking about something transactional or temporary. They were talking about the future. Rebecca's voice, calm and specific and businesslike in a way that Caroline had never heard from her sister before. Bo was describing what a post-divorce financial settlement might look like if Daniel positioned things correctly. She was talking about assets. She was talking about the house. She was talking about timing. Specifically, she mentioned that their grandmother, Dorothy Mitchell's mother, was 86 years old and in declining health, and that it would be worth waiting to see what happened before making any final decisions. Their grandmother. Rebecca was factoring their grandmother's death into the financial planning of her sister's betrayal. Caroline listened to the entire recording twice, sitting in front of her own house with cold coffee and the morning just beginning to lighten around her. And then she called Patricia Walters. Patricia's reaction to the first recording was measured, which was what Caroline needed from her. She did not gasp. She did not say she could not believe it. She listened, took notes, and told Caroline that what she had was potentially significant and that she needed to keep going. Keep the recorder active. Keep documenting. Do not change anything about your daily routine. Do not give either of them any reason to believe that anything has changed. Act exactly as you have been acting. Caroline did exactly that. For the next 4 months, while working full nursing shifts and cooking Sunday dinners, and sitting across from Rebecca at her own kitchen table and watching her husband sleep in the bed they had shared for 9 years, Caroline Mitchell recorded everything. And what those recordings contained, piece by piece, was the architecture of a plan that had been in place for far longer than 3 weeks. Far longer, even, than Caroline had feared during those first terrible days of suspicion. The recordings established, across multiple conversations, that Daniel had been moving money out of their joint accounts in incremental amounts over a period of no less than 22 months. The amounts were not large enough to trigger any of the automatic alerts their bank had set for unusual activity. Whoever had advised him on this approach had been careful, or he had been careful on his own, which was perhaps more chilling to consider. The money was going into an account held in the name of a limited liability company registered in the state of Georgia, which neither of them had ever lived in or had professional connections to, Weinkorn in the name of a company called Ridgeline Property Holdings, LLC. Ridgeline Property Holdings had one asset, a small rental property outside of Murfreesboro, Tennessee, that had been purchased 14 months earlier, titled in Rebecca's name. They had bought a house together, with Caroline's money, while Rebecca sat at Caroline's kitchen table on Sunday evenings and ate Caroline's food and refilled Caroline's wine glass and talked about how much she loved her sister. The financial picture was not the hardest part of what the recordings revealed. It was awful, and it was documented, and it would eventually be handled. The hardest part came from a recording made on a Sunday in August, a Sunday when Caroline had been at Vanderbilt for an unexpected extended shift and had not come home for the dinner that had been planned. Daniel and Rebecca had spent that evening in the Sylvan Park house together, alone, and the conversation captured on the recorder that evening covered nearly 2 hours. It was, in many ways, a portrait of a relationship that had been fully formed for years. There was a familiarity in it that was not the familiarity of 2 people conducting an affair. It was the familiarity of 2 people who had convinced themselves, over time, that what they were doing was something other than what it was. At one point, Rebecca said something that Caroline has returned to many times in the years since, something she has described as the line that clarified everything she had been uncertain about regarding who her sister really was. Rebecca said, her voice easy and unguarded in the emptiness of the house, "I have always been the better sister. Oh, she just got lucky first." That sentence, those 11 words, Caroline heard them on a Tuesday morning in the Vanderbilt parking garage, and she sat with them for a long time. Not because they hurt in the way that you might expect a sentence like that to hurt, though they did hurt genuinely and deeply, but because they illuminated something. They illuminated the shape of a rivalry that Rebecca had been carrying for decades, quietly and invisibly, inside the warmth of a sibling relationship that Caroline had believed was real. They illuminated the Sunday dinners and the maid of honor toast and the 6 weeks in the East Nashville apartment and every phone call from Knoxville where Rebecca talked for an hour about herself and then asked briefly how Caroline was doing. They illuminated a life that had been, for Caroline, a relationship, and for Rebecca, a competition, and what that meant, What that finally, fully clarified was that Rebecca had not fallen into anything. She had not been overwhelmed by feelings she could not control. She had looked at her sister's life and decided, with the cool calculation of someone who had always known exactly what she wanted and had never been especially troubled by how she got it, that she was going to take it. By September of 2015, Caroline had gathered enough. She had 4 months of recordings. She had financial records she had quietly obtained from the joint accounts showing the pattern of withdrawals. She had call logs. She had the hotel charges. She had Patricia Walters, who had spent the better part of those 4 months reviewing everything and preparing for what came next. Caroline had not changed her behavior toward Daniel in any detectable way. She had not changed her behavior toward Rebecca. She had continued every Sunday dinner, continued every ordinary Tuesday evening, continued saying goodnight to her husband of 9 years in the same voice she had always used. The composure required to maintain that, for 4 months, while carrying what she was carrying, is something that is difficult to fully communicate. She has described it as living inside 2 lives simultaneously: the visible one, which continued normally, and the invisible one, which was the truth of what was happening and what she was preparing to do about it. She did not crack. Not once. She will tell you that what held her together during those months was not anger, though the anger was there, and it was real, and it ran deep. What held her together was purpose. She knew what she was building, she knew what she was going to do with it, and she was going to do it right. She filed for divorce on a Thursday morning in October 2015. Patricia had prepared everything. The filing included a motion for emergency financial protections based on documented evidence of marital asset dissipation, the legal term for what Daniel had been doing with the Ridgeline account. The motion was supported by the financial records and, critically, by specific excerpts from the recordings, which Patricia had determined were legally admissible under Tennessee's one-party consent statute. The LLC in Georgia was flagged immediately. A court order freezing the associated accounts was granted within 48 hours. The Murfreesboro property, the one titled in Rebecca's name, yet purchased with money from the joint marital account, was identified as a marital asset subject to equitable distribution and placed under legal review. The entire mechanism of what Daniel and Rebecca had spent months constructing began to dismantle itself with extraordinary speed once the right people could see it clearly. Daniel's attorney contacted Patricia's office within 72 hours of the filing, requesting a settlement meeting. When they sat across that conference table, Daniel on one side with his lawyer, Caroline on the other with Patricia, Daniel looked, by every account, like a man who had spent 72 hours understanding for the first time that the woman he had underestimated for years had been, the entire time, operating several moves ahead of him. He had assumed that Caroline's silence was ignorance. He had mistaken her calm for obliviousness. He had spent 4 months living in the same house as a woman who was quietly documenting everything he was doing and was entirely prepared to use every single piece of it, and he had not known. Patricia later told Caroline that in 19 years of family law practice, she had not seen a settlement resolve as swiftly or as completely as that one. Daniel signed. He signed the house over. He signed the financial restitution agreement. He signed the full and complete dissolution of everything he had tried to quietly move out of reach over the previous 22 months. He signed all of it in a conference room in Berry Hill, Nashville, on a gray afternoon in October, and Caroline sat across from him and was perfectly still and did not say a single unnecessary word. What happened to Rebecca after the filing became public knowledge within their family, which it did quickly because legal proceedings in Tennessee are a matter of public record, and because Dorothy Mitchell still had friends in Nashville, is a story in itself. Rebecca had not been present at the settlement meeting. She had not been a party to the divorce, only to the circumstances that produced it. But the Murfreesboro property was identified in the proceedings, and the origin of the funds used to purchase it was documented. And when James and Dorothy Mitchell drove up from Harlan to sit in Caroline's kitchen and hear what their younger daughter had done, the conversation was one of the most difficult hours of Caroline's entire life. Not because her parents refused to believe her, but because the process of believing it, in real time, was something painful to witness. James Mitchell sat at that kitchen table, with his hands flat on the surface, and did not speak for a long time after Caroline finished. Dorothy Mitchell cried. And then Dorothy Mitchell asked, in a voice Caroline has never entirely forgotten, what she could have done differently. Not what Rebecca had done wrong. What she herself could have done differently. Caroline thought about that question for a long time afterward. She is still thinking about it. Rebecca, confronted by their parents, did not immediately confess. She did something that surprised Caroline only briefly before it became predictable. She reframed. She said she was in love. She said love was not something you chose. She said she had tried to fight her feelings for years. Which was technically true if you define years as the entire duration of their relationship and fighting as the period between deciding what she wanted and beginning to actively pursue it, which Rebecca apparently did. Some of the Mitchell family accepted this framing because the alternative, accepting that someone they loved was capable of sustained and deliberate manipulation, was a harder thing to hold. Caroline has never blamed the family members who struggled. She has been very clear about that. Betrayal of this scale does not just damage the person at its center. It radiates outward through every relationship it touches, and the people on the edges of it are left to choose between two versions of reality with incomplete information. And sometimes they choose wrong, and sometimes the wrongness is temporary, and sometimes it is not. Daniel and Rebecca stayed together in the beginning. There had been enough of the plan already in motion, enough emotional investment on both sides, enough justification built up across enough years, that the collapse of the financial strategy did not immediately collapse the relationship itself. They moved into a rental apartment in Germantown, on the north side of Nashville, in the months following the divorce. Caroline knows because she was, for a time, aware of the general contours of their life, not because she was monitoring it, but because Nashville is not as large as it looks, and because people talk. She knows that it was not, by most accounts, a peaceful arrangement. She knows that the weight of what they had done, which is different, in significant ways, from the weight of an ordinary affair. It carries the particular heaviness of premeditation, is not something that simply disappears once the object of the plan is no longer in the picture. She knows that by the end of 2016, they had separated, and that the separation was not amicable. She knows this because Rebecca called her in December of that year. It was the first time they had spoken since before the divorce filing. Caroline answered the phone. She listened to what her sister said. She said very little in return. She has never described the specific content of that call in detail, only that it confirmed everything she had already understood about the fundamental difference between remorse and regret, between being sorry for what you did and being sorry for how it ended up for you. She has not spoken to Rebecca since. Caroline Mitchell is in her mid-40s now. She still lives in Nashville, though not in the Sylvan Park house, which she sold in 2016, and the proceeds of which she used to purchase a smaller, quieter place in the Hillsborough Village neighborhood. A 2-bedroom bungalow with a front porch and a garden that she has spent the better part of 7 years making exactly what she wants it to be. She is still a nurse at Vanderbilt, where she has been for more than 2 decades, and she has been promoted twice since the divorce. And she is, by all accounts of the people who work alongside her, exactly the kind of nurse that patients remember, and that younger nurses come to for guidance. She has rebuilt her social world with the precision of someone who has learned, the hardest possible way, that proximity does not equal loyalty, and that the people worth holding close are the people who show you, through consistent action over time, that they can be trusted with the real version of you. She has spoken to her mother 3 times since the divorce. Dorothy Mitchell reached out, eventually, and apologized, not for her younger daughter's actions, which were not hers to apologize for, but for her own. For the question she asked in that kitchen about what she could have done differently. For the years of Sunday phone calls in which she had, without ever meaning to cause harm, communicated to both of her daughters that Rebecca's chaos was something to be absorbed, and that Caroline's steadiness was something to be relied upon, as though stability were a resource rather than a person. The apology was genuine. Caroline accepted it. They do not speak regularly. There is a difference between forgiving someone and returning to the version of a relationship that existed before you understood what it actually cost you. Da and Caroline has made her peace with holding both of those truths at once. She has been asked, in the years since, whether she feels that justice was served. It is a word she uses carefully. The legal and financial outcomes were, by any objective standard, favorable. The recording strategy worked precisely as Patricia had hoped. The settlement was comprehensive. The Murfreesboro property was ultimately returned to the marital estate as part of the distribution. Daniel left Nashville within a year of the divorce and relocated to Atlanta, where he had taken a position with a different engineering firm, and Caroline has no meaningful information about the current state of his life and has not sought any. She does not spend time thinking about what became of the person who sat across from her at a kitchen table and told her that her sister had been there for him in ways she had not. She has found, over time, that the space previously occupied by that marriage has been filled with things that were always hers. Her work, her friends, her garden, the early mornings on the front porch in Hillsborough Village, with coffee and the Nashville air, and the quiet, complete sensation of belonging entirely to herself. What she does think about, what she returns to regularly in conversations with the people she trusts, is not the betrayal itself, but the silence around it. The years of accumulated small concessions, the habit of filing things away, the reflexive generosity of a woman who was taught from childhood that keeping a family intact was worth almost any personal cost, and who extended that lesson into adulthood until the cost became everything. She thinks about the particular vulnerability of people who lead with trust, who take relationships at face value, who choose to believe the best about the people they love, even when the evidence suggests something more complicated. She does not think of this vulnerability as a flaw. She thinks of it as something that was used against her, deliberately and over a long period of time, by people who understood it and calculated that it would hold. She thinks about the moment, that Tuesday evening in the kitchen, standing 6 feet from the counter, with the phone buzzing and the slow cooker smell in the air, and all of it still intact and salvageable, when something shifted in her, something quiet and irreversible, and she walked over and she picked up the phone. She thinks about what she found. She thinks about the decision she made in the 90 seconds between the counter and the edge of the bed. She thinks about the 4 months of composure and the recorder in the living room and the conference table in Berry Hill and Daniel's hand signing line after line after line. And then she thinks about the front porch in Hillsborough Village and the morning light and the garden coming in the way she planted it, and the fact that none of the things that matter to her now have anyone else's name on them. They are hers. Entirely and only hers. She thought the silence would protect her. She was wrong about which silence she meant. That is where we are leaving Caroline's story today. But before you go, I want to ask you something, and I want you to genuinely sit with it before you type your answer. Because I think the most important question this story raises is not about what Daniel did or what Rebecca did, or even what the recordings contained, The most important question is the one Caroline herself has spent years turning over. What do we owe to the people who love us poorly? What do we owe to the sisters who watched us too carefully? To the husbands who performed faithfulness while planning something else? To the mothers who loved peace more than they loved the truth? Do we owe them silence? Do we owe them continued access to our lives? Do we owe them, after everything, the kind of grace that asks nothing in return? Drop your answer in the comments. I am genuinely asking. I want to know what you think. And if this story stayed with you, if it moved you, or troubled you, or made you think about someone in your own life a little differently, subscribe to this channel, because we are going to keep telling stories exactly like this one. Stories that are not simple. Stories that do not end neatly. Stories about the people we trust, and the price we sometimes pay for that trust, and what we are capable of becoming on the other side of it. We will see you in the next one.